Welcome to A Scientific Life, E.K. Janaki Ammal and the Patriarchy of Science in the 20th Century. This lecture is a part of the series of public lectures and discussions organized by Science Gallery Bengaluru for its first digital pop-up exhibition, Phytopia. For Phytopia, we hope to bring together engineers, scientists, designers, artists, and biohackers to create an experience where visitors can experiment and explore beyond the kitchen, the lab, and the farm. This program is organized in collaboration with the Bangalore International Center. A warm welcome to today's speaker, Vinita Damodaran. Vinita is a historian of modern India, interested in sustainable development dialogues in the global south. Her work ranges from social and political history of Bihar to the environmental history of South Asia, including using historical records to understand climate change in the Indian Ocean world. She has also written about the life and scientific contributions of Janaki Ammal, who is India's first woman botanist. We have an exhibit dedicated to Janaki Ammal as a part of Phytopia. You can find a link to that in the description below. Before we begin, I would like to remind our audience that Vinita will be present for a Q&A session after this lecture. You may post your questions in the chat box and we will pass them on to her. You can also find a link to the live Q&A session in the description box. Over to you, Vinita.
Thank you very much, Gayatri, for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be able to talk about E.K. Janaki Ammal. And as you correctly said, the topic today is on the patriarchy of science, and this will become quite apparent to you as I go on. So I first came across Janaki Ammal when looking through a massive volume by W.L. Thomas which was dated 1956, on man's role in changing the face of the earth. This was a very inspired conference that was held in Chicago, and it was about the impact of man, as they then called it, on changing the way in which in transforming the earth, as it were. And this particular conference had in it several papers, very key papers by key scientists, but they were mainly written by white Anglo-Saxon men, with one important exception, which was the paper given by E.K. Janaki Ammal, who was a distinguished woman geneticist and global plant geographer, a professor of botany at Madras, and the author of the Chromosome Atlas of Cultivated Plants. Now, this was an extremely significant paper, because what she was doing was talking about the subsistence economy of Indian agriculture. And this particular paper resonated very well in the conference. Now, Janaki Ammal was relatively unknown to me at this time, and I then decided to do a little bit of research on who she was and what her work was about. And her contribution to the Thomas volume, as I said, also was contributing not only to the history of environmental and subsistence agriculture in India, but it paid particular attention to the difference between patriarchal, matriarchal, and tribal agronomies. So Ammal, in this sense, can be said to have pioneered both indigenous and gendered environmental approaches to land use history. And the neglect of her contribution to environmental history and the history of science is notable, as she was to become later on a well-regarded and important scientist in the post-independence period. So she sort of disappears from view, though she becomes quite important in the period immediately after post-independence. And this was a quest of mine to search for the story of this unknown Indian woman scientist. So what I'm going to be doing in this paper then is contextualizing Ammal within the historiography of science, to understand how Ammal negotiated the boundaries of caste and race, to understand the patriarchy of science in Britain and India when she was operating, that is between 1930 to 1980s, the making of a national scientist, to look a little bit at eugenics and C.D. Darlington and J.B.S. Haldane, both very well-known scientists in their own way in Britain. J.B.S. Haldane moved to India, as we know, later on. To look at the networks of national and international science and the constitution of science at the end of empire and after, and to focus a little bit on retirement and environmental activism in terms of Janaki Ammal's final career. One of her contemporaries notes that Janaki Ammal was an original thinker, doing epochal work on intergeneric hybrids such as Saccharum zea, Saccharum erantheus, Saccharum imperata, and Saccharum sorghum. Her pioneering work was on the cytogenetics of Saccharum officinarum, that is sugarcane, and interspecific and intergeneric hybrids involving sugarcane and both closely related grass genera, very distantly related to things like bamboo and bambusa. So mainly her work was on creating hybrids, and she had numerous articles, including in Nature in 1938 and Heredity in 1972. So when we look at why she disappears in terms of despite having done such significant work, we need to understand the way in which the historiography of science was written up, both in the pre-independence period and in the post-independence period. Much of the historiography focused on the contribution of native male scientists, including in the post-colonial period on Indian male scientists, but not on women scientists. And a more recent work which looked at women in science in the context of India ignores Janaki Ammal. So what we're trying to do here today, as I said, is by situating on her work and her career, focus a little bit on this fascinating woman on her life. So she starts she was born, as we know, in 1897 in Tellicherry in Kerala. She goes to Michigan as a Barber Fellow in 1925, and she receives a DSc in Michigan in 1931. And this was a very, very significant event. She was the first woman botanist in the US, so a significant first here again. In 1932 to 34, she joins Trivandrum as a professor of botany. And 1934 to 39, she joins the Sugarcane Breeding Institute in Coimbatore. Between 40 and 45, she returns to London and becomes the assistant cytologist at the John Innes Institute, working with C.D. Darlington. In 1951, she returns to reorganize the Botanical Survey of India, and in 1984, she dies after working in her lab in Motherwell Vale in her last years. So that is a short trajectory of her life. So her career can be traced to when she started working as a botanist and cytologist, first after finishing her PhD, first in India as a professor of botany in Trivandrum, and then later on as a geneticist in the Sugarcane Breeding Institute, and later on at the John Innes Institute in London. And this is very significant. It was here that she studied the origin and evolution of cultivated plants, resulting in the chromosome atlas of cultivated plants, a very, very significant work which she co-authored with C.D. Darlington, and which became a very important source for cytological work on the economic plants of the world. On her return to India in 1948, she became a leading scientist of the nation who wanted to create a national system of generic science. She was able to do this first as director of the Central Botanical Laboratory of the Government of India at Lucknow, and she had several accolades to her name. She was to become the Fellow of the Linnean Society of London, the Royal Geographical Society, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, the and she started, for example, the Indian Academy of Sciences, and became one of its only and one of its first women members. So an honorary Legium Doctoris was bestowed on her in 1955 by the University of Michigan. And one of her scientific contemporaries, C.S. Subramaniam, writes about her passion for plants, crop plants, garden plants, plantation crops, medicinal crops, and tribal plants. So when she joins C.D. Darlington at the John Innes Institute, once again, it's a very, very male institute. C.D. Darlington himself is a very male scientist who treats the women working under him as mainly people who are in subservient positions. And she was able to challenge this by collaborating with him directly on this magnum opus, the chromosome atlas of cultivated plants. She also in 1944, as I said, became the first woman member of the RHS, the first female employee of the RHS, and her focus on polyploidian plant evolution was very, very significant during her stint there, which continued on her return to India, where she worked on the genera Solanum, Datura, Mentha, Champagonum, and Diascora, beside a range of medicinal and other plants. The confluence of Chinese and Malayan plants with Indian floristic elements in the Northeast, she said, led to natural hybridization between these and contributed greatly to species diversification. As an officer on special duty, entrusted with the task of reorganizing the Botanical Survey of India post-independence, she became a progressive national scientist. As Subramaniam was to note very perceptively, though cytology was her forte, her work embraced genetics, evolution, phytogeography, and ethnobotany. So how do we then situate her scientific contribution in terms of her personal life? And this is what I want to concentrate on a little bit. It's very, very important to understand the importance of individual trajectories in such a narrative, because these trajectories run across state archived paper trails, and the narratives of a person's life link together markedly different places. And in some senses, the networks that Janaki Ammal built up, I think, are very, very significant, because she became a sort of meeting point for these various influences. So she became, in many ways, mobile, effusive, decentered through her connections with different individuals across different regions of the globe. So by looking at such a career, such as Janaki Ammal, it helps to shed new light on historical debates on gender, nation, race, and science in the context of empire. So the case here that one makes when we look at a biography of a woman scientist such as Ammal is to bring the background of her life into view. And it's a very, very powerful way of narrating the past. So Ammal, as I said, comes from a lower caste background in North Malabar. She had a checkered ancestry. Her mother was the illegitimate child of John Child Hannington of the Madras Civil Service, a member of the well-known imperial family who had resided in India for generations. And she was one of 11 children, obviously one of the brightest. Her siblings, her sisters, many of them chose marriage, while she chose a career of science above marriage. And she, in many ways, assumed a very lowly trajectory in life because she had chosen a career in science instead of marriage. And this constraining background comes into force, and we can see her in terms of the constraining background, in terms of gender, caste, and race, which she sort of struggled with as she climbed the hierarchy in terms of the scientific establishment, both the British and the Indian scientific establishment, as a lower caste, mixed race Indian. But her achievements, as I said, were phenomenal. It was when she was working as a lecturer at the Women's Christian College in Madras. She receives a scholarship from Michigan University, where she was granted her DSc in 1931. And this was a time when many British and American universities were barring the entry of women. And it is in this context that her career assumes enormous significance. When she joined C.D. Darlington at the John Innes Institute in 1931, she's been sent there by her supervisor, Bartlett, to work with him on cytology. And he himself, as I said, was a patriarch in science, but her friendship with him signals the start of a very long relationship, professional and personal. Darlington was one of the most amazing geneticists, evolutionists, and biological statisticians of the century. His first cytological work, Recent Advances in Cytology and the Evolution of Genetic Systems in 1932 and 1939, respectively, was hailed as a fundamental contribution to evolutionary thought. And when she joins this institute, she joins one of the most formidable team of scientists. And when Darlington links up with Ammal, he is very, very impressed by her energy, her independence, her scientific, in some senses, genius. But he is loath to recognize it officially. And the correspondence between Ammal and Darlington, which is preserved in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, shows the nature of the relationship, where Darlington damns her very often with faint praise while working with her, while collaborating with her on a lot of associated projects. He does not give her the recognition that she needs. Very similarly, when she arrives in India, and she has different periods of her life where she's working, as I said, in the Sugarcane Breeding Institute in 1938 and so on, she faces once again, patriarchy of the Indian scientific establishment. And her letters are very, very revealing of this patriarchy. There's one letter she writes in August 1938, which I quote, and it's up here for you. And she's writing about the visit of the biologist Reginald Ruggles Gates to Coimbatore while she's working at the Sugarcane Breeding Institute. And the head of the institute at this time is T.S. Venkatraman, a Brahmin. And she says, who is in some senses constantly unimpressed by Ammal's efforts to rise within the hierarchy. And she writes about the way in which Venkatraman does not recognize her efforts or her scholarship. It's taken, I quote, 7 long months to undo the harm that Gates did in the course of a single day spent in Coimbatore. Mr. Venkatraman was completely taken in by the professor's keen interest in the work done at Coimbatore, his fund of information, and his gracious manner. Hence the doubt expressed not to me, but to Venkatraman about the validity of the Saccharum Zia cross, which stuck in the expert's brain, and my note to Nature was not sent up to the Director of Agriculture for the necessary permission to publish it outside India. I very nearly decided to leave the station as a result of this, and life became very complicated. However, I refused to be defeated, and I'm glad to report that Venkatraman is at last convinced that the cross is genuine. So what she's referring to here, quote close, is the fact that Venkatraman refuses to recognize that one of the intergeneric hybrids that she was producing was a genuine one. And it was only after great persuasion that she was able to persuade him that this was a very important scientific breakthrough. And the paper in Nature was finally published in 1938. So you see Janaki Ammal coming up against this patriarchy, both in the John Innes Institute vis-a-vis Darlington, who damns her with faint praise. And there is this very classic letter that Darlington writes about Janaki Ammal. The question of Janaki Ammal seems to me to be part of a larger problem. Practitioners of cytology in India are very numerous, but cytological work of outstanding interest is unknown. The reason for this seems to be that Indians go in for cytology because they think it is a matter of technique and needs no thought otherwise. Therefore, when I say Janaki Ammal understands her work better than anyone else, I do not mean to pay her a vast compliment. I think she is doing sound work and will continue to do so for some time, just because a great deal of elementary exploration in this field is necessary, and she cannot fail to be of value to the geneticist working with her. Quote close. He further noted, I think it is a great pity that numbers of Indians come to this country to take PhD degrees in cytology just because they think it is an easy subject, and having obtained their PhDs, which they never fail to do, return to secure a post in India. We refuse to take such people here. So what you're seeing in both these letters, which I've quoted to you, Ammal about her treatment by Venkatraman and Darlington on Ammal, you can see how her career was thwarted by the patriarchy of science, both in Britain and in India. At the annual meeting of the Indian Academy of Sciences, a creation of the Nobel Prize laureate C.V. Raman, Janaki Ammal was to note how she felt greatly relieved to leave the company of the Sugarcane Breeding Institute. She said it was jolly to get back among the few real scientists of India after the pseudo-scientific atmosphere of Coimbatore. A contrast between Raman and Venkatraman is very great. But C.V. Raman, as well as we know, was not immune to imposing his own patriarchy on the scientific lab that he ran. So I think this was a problem for women scientists in general in this period at that time. Janaki Ammal returns to England in 1939 to attend the 7th International Genetical Congress, and she's unable to go back because of the war to India. And this is when she has a second stint in England, where she works on the chromosome atlas of cultivated plants. And she also joins the John Innes Institute at that time, and later on she joins the RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society, where she develops the Magnolia cobus Janaki Ammal as one of the first female employees of the RHS in Wisley. At this time, constantly both Kew and the RHS are sending plants to her. For example, in one case, an Argentine couple claimed to have developed a grass with exceptional qualities, and this was passed on to Sir Geoffrey Evans at Kew, a leading scientist, who in his reply related that this grass was sorghum haleponese, as identified by F.W. Ballard of the Herbarium. When Darlington sent the specimen to Janaki Ammal, she differed from both the Argentine couple and Ballard, identifying the plant as the recently described sorghum alum. So here was a woman scientist who was challenging the male scientific establishment, and you can see why it did not go down very well. Here she is, a very beautiful image of her in London with Oliver Darlington, C.D. Darlington's son. The next stage of her life is when she comes back to India, and then she begins working. And the story is that she travels back on a plane in 1948. It is Nehru's approach that gets her back to India. Nehru's on that plane. It's unclear whether they both spoke, but clearly Nehru's very keen to get important scientists to return to India and to take up important positions in India. And this was the 1950s was also a very, very important decade for Indian science, when nationalist scientists such as the notable chemist S.S. Bhatnagar and Meghnad Saha, the eminent astrophysicists, were part of the scientific establishment. And she joins the scientific establishment in holding up the baton for pure science and not for applied science. And Saha was to note, for example, that pure science is the seed of applied science, and the neglect of pure science would be like spending a large amount on manuring and plowing the land, but then to omit sowing of any kind. So this was a debate about whether you needed science in the universities and needed to encourage science in the universities, or to have a more utilitarian idea of science, where science remained in physical laboratories and nationalist institutions. And S.S. Bhatnagar, as we know, sought to reorganize the Council of Industrial and Scientific Research, which was founded in 1942 within the framework of a government-administered science. His views won Nehru over, and though the CSIR continued to interact with Indian universities, it was applied research that dominated the activities of Indian science. And Ammal was very, very critical of this, because she believed that damage had been done, resulting in the long-term neglect of scientific endeavor in the universities. And I just wanted to make this point. Ammal also became extremely important when she returned to India to work with a central botanical laboratory in Lucknow, which was set up, and she was asked to reorganize the Botanical Survey of India as the government-appointed advisor. However, her academic writing showed a disquiet with the government's increasingly dominant discourse of scientific industrialism. And at the Chicago meeting in 1955, as I said, her paper essayed subsistence agriculture in India, which was quite important because she was talking about the destruction of Indian forests and the destruction of Indian plants. And she writes about this when she says, I went 37 miles from Shillong in search of the only tree of Magnolia griffithii in that part of Assam, and found that it had been burned down. So all through the 50s, her botanical investigations continue. Her cytogeographic studies on rhododendron, camellia, magnolia, buddleia revealed that northeastern Himalaya and the southeastern provinces of China were very active and highly diversified floristically and phytogeographically. These areas, as she argued, possessed diploids with very wide range, followed progressively by smaller range of polyploids. And her work argued that this was an area which had endemics, which were confined to narrow ranges. So she was, in some senses, challenging the Kew tradition and indulging in what you can now call more speculative botany. And after she becomes the director of the Central Botanical Laboratory, and she reorganizes the Botanical Survey of India, she divides India into 6 cytogeographical units or circles, each with its own herbarium and a cytotaxonomic laboratory. Her plans came into difficulties when the government appointed a Reverend Shantapu, a Jesuit Spaniard, an appointee of, in some senses, a prodigy of Kew, as the director of the BSI, Botanical Survey of India. Janaki Ammal was devastated, and she felt that 2 years of her work in India had been a waste of time. I quote, once again, the patriarchy of science had come in to thwart her. And she writes, the government of India has appointed as chief botanist of India a man with a Kew tradition, and I, the director of the Central Botanical Laboratory, must now take orders from him. Kew has won a decisive victory, and the news has been jubilantly received there. I'm very angry. As a systematic botanist, I have nothing against him, but I was hoping the Botanical Survey, after its reorganization, could be something different to what it was in 1856, when Hooker wrote the Flora of British India. Kew has won, Sir Edward Salisbury has won, and we have lost. I feel sick. When I heard the news, I ran away to the wilds of Malabar to collect wild yams that our Aboriginal tribes dig up. So here is Ammal once again defeated after she becomes the director of the Central Botanical Laboratory by a government appointee who's also a prodigy of the Imperial Institution of Kew, and even after independence has some powers in terms of its appointments in India. So some writers have talked about the obstacles to women's experiences of power within science were only matched by the even greater obstacles of legitimizing such power once it accrues through success or prolonged service. The profound difficulty faced by women as holders of scientific authority may also explain their minor showing in major scientific debates, theoretical advances, or large-scale empirical projects, all of which require potential and actual leadership of men. So gender ideology becomes very important in access to and pursuit of scientific careers. And this can account for the curtailment of Janaki Ammal's leadership position at important junctures. It's also important to note the continuing influence of metropolitan science in the immediate post-independence context, and the fact that the man of a Kew tradition was chosen above her. Janaki Ammal also has a very, very interesting career at this time, where she's still collaborating with Haldane and with Darlington to understand the castes and tribes of India. And she contributes very, very interestingly to this chromosomal project on genetics. And this work is quite interesting. And I don't have time to go into this in this presentation. But plant geneticists at this time were becoming increasingly interested in human genetics. And eugenics, a term that meant good breeding, coined by Francis Galton in 1904, was being used by a term that was being used also by Jebius Haldane and R.A. Fisher, who adopted a mathematical population approach using the gene not as the chromosome, but as a fundamental unit of selection. And these ideas were prevalent in India at this time and had an impact also on Ammal, who was supplying, for example, data on castes and tribes to Jebius Haldane and to C.D. Darlington. And this link between man, culture, and biology, which finally was dismissed only by the UNESCO conference in the 50s, had its impact on science also in India. And this is a theme that could be that we could look at in the question-answer session. And Jebius Haldane, who became the first Wilden Professor of Genetics in the University of London in 1937, was at the forefront of these debates. He, as we know, moved to India, and he became extremely important in debates on science and biology in India. And the relationship between Darlington, Haldane, and Ammal is a very, very interesting part of the narrative of Darlington and Ammal's letters that are now held at the Bodleian. The final years, and this is, I'm moving towards a conclusion, the final years of Ammal's life were taken up by her work on the Silent Valley Project. This was an amazingly interesting phase of her career. Ammal's retirement and environmental activism go together. And by 1962, she had seen herself as too old to be employed by the Indian Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, and was looking for new avenues of research. But she continued in the laboratory as an emeritus scientist, toying with the idea of the cytogeography of flowering plants, not cultivated plants. She had done that. This was about flowering plants. And she also became very, very interested in an environmental campaign to preserve the Silent Valley. And this debate took up a lot of time. As we know, this was a protest about the dam on the Kuntipura River, which was the part of a hydroelectric project. And she realized that the Silent Valley in Palakkad was home to a rich variety of plants, mammals, and birds endemic to the Western Ghats. And she was very, very upset that the Kerala State Electricity Board had announced plans to begin a dam construction, which would in effect have flooded 8.2 kilometers of virgin rainforest. And the issue did raise a huge public outcry, but Janaki Ammal was a very, very important public voice, along with other important scientists such as M.S. Swaminathan and B.P. Paul, who backed the movement. And the work of these scientists, I think, is very, very important, which helped declare the Silent Valley a national park in India. As she wrote to Darlington at this time about her project, I quote, "You will be pleased to know that the Kerala government has been forced to give up destroying the Silent Valley. As the oldest forest in India, if not the world, we have set up a project to bring some of the plants and grow them in our ethnobotanical garden. My ethnobotanical garden at Shornur, Kerala, which has a climate similar to the valley, being some 40 miles or so away." So here she has actually created a new project out of her work to protect the Silent Valley, to force the Indian government to understand the importance of the genetic study of trees. So her active life as a scientist and advisor to the Ministry of Science and Technology continued in the 70s. Her laboratory garden in Maduravale at the University of Madras boasted an important collection of economic plants gathered from the wild. And she was asked by the government of India to produce a book on medicinal plants of South India when she was 82 years old. You can see how significant she was. Well enough, she said at that time, to go to the Irula tribes who sell medicine plants and sell them to the native physicians. I found an interesting Solanum hybrid specimen used for family planning by the tribe. Having retired to the University of Madras, she worked quietly in the Botanical Research Lab in Maduravale in the last years of her life, her passion for science undimmed. Her last letter to Darlington is dated 4th July 1980, some months before he died. "When shall I see you again? Will I see you before I die?" It is a very poignant letter, and with the death of Darlington, ended a correspondence that had lasted over 50 years. Ammal died working in her research lab at the University of Madras on 7th February 1984. She was 87 years old. Widely cited in scientific journals and well respected among scientific circles in her own lifetime, her contribution in Indian science has never been adequately recognized and had been largely forgotten till more recently. There's been a spurt of interest in her life. And this exhibition, I think, that you're going to see will go in some way to reviving her contribution to Indian science. Her epochal work in cytology, genetics, evolution, cytogeography, and ethnobotany should be recognized and should continue to be recognized. And also her institutional building activities in directing the Central Botanical Laboratory in Lucknow, restructuring the Botanical Survey of India in a newly independent India, and the creation of regional research laboratories as scientific advisor to several government institutions, and finally, her environmental activism in protecting the Silent Valley. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vinita. It has been a very enlightening lecture. Thank you for your time and for sharing your valuable perspective with our audience. I would like to remind our audience that we're hosting a live Q&A session with her as soon as this session ends, and you can find a link to that in the description box below. Thank you,
Thank
Vinita.
you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be able to talk to you.